be able to back up. The United States has just launched Project Freedom, and the name alone should tell you everything you need to know about what Washington thinks it is doing, and what Tehran is terrified it cannot stop. This is not a drill. This is not a bluff. This is the most consequential move in the Strait of Hormuz since the war began, and it is unfolding right now as you watch this. But to truly understand why this moment is so explosive, why Iran is scrambling, and why the world's energy markets are hanging on every transmission from U.S. Central Command, we need to go back to the beginning. Not years back, weeks back, because everything that is happening today is the direct result of decisio. NS made in a very compressed and very violent period of time. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched what became known as Operation Epic Fury, a devastating aerial campaign against Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, dismantled Iran's air defense, sea networks, shattered its conventional navy, and crippled its ballistic missile infrastructure. The stated goals were regime change and the elimination of Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. The strikes were swift, overwhelming, and unlike anything the moderate and Middle East had ever seen. Iran could not fight back in the traditional sense. Its conventional military was being dismantled in real time. So instead, the IRGC issued warnings forbidding passage through the Strait of Hormuz, began boarding and attacking merchant PS, and laid sea mines in the waterway. It was asymmetric warfare at its most calculated. Iran did not need an aircraft carrier to paralyze the global economy. It just needed to make one narrow stretch of water too dangerous for anyone to cross. And for weeks, it worked. Before the conflict, around 3,000 vessels used the strait each month, carrying roughly 20% of global petroleum and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. That traffic didn't just slow down, it collapsed. Following the closure of the Strait of Hormuz on March 4th, 2006, Brent crude surged past $120 per barrel, and Qatar Energy was forced to declare force majeure on all of its exports. Major shipping sea companies, including Maersk, CMA, CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended all transits. The global energy system, built on the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would always be open, suddenly had no floor beneath it. And then came the American countermove that nobody fully anticipated. On April 13th, the U.S. launched its own blockade of Iranian ports, targeting all ships seeking to reach Iranian destinations, creating what analysts quickly described as a dual blockade of the strait. Iran was now doing to the world what the U.S. was simultaneously doing to Iran. Two blockades occupying the same waterway, with the entire global economy trapped in between. Every day the dual blockade held, the pressure on Iran's regime intensified in ways that no airstrike ever could. Because airstrikes destroy hardware. Economic strangulation destroys the will to govern. And that is precisely what the United States is now banking on. Since the American BLO blockade began on April 13th, U.S. Central Command reported that 49 commercial ships had been turned back from Iranian ports. Iran was collecting tolls from desperate shipping companies to let vessels through its side of the strait. But U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent confirmed that Iran had received less than $1.3 million in total tolls, which he called a pittance compared to Tehran's previous daily oil revenues. Then, on May 3rd, President Donald Trump made an announcement that changed the entire calculation. He posted on Truth Social that the United States would begin guiding ships through the Strait of Hormuz, calling the operation Project Freedom, framed part LI as a humanitarian mission for crews stranded inside the Gulf for weeks with dwindling food and supplies. U.S. Central Command confirmed the mission would involve guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms, and D-15,000 service members. This was not a diplomatic gesture. This was a declaration of operational dominance over the most strategical, important body of water on Earth. And today, May 4th, 2026, it went live. 2 U.S.-flagged merchant vessels sailed through the Strait of Hormuz under American military support, the first such transit since Project Freedom was launched. Iran immediately claimed it had prevented U.S. warships from entering. CENTCOM immediately denied it. Oil prices jumped 5% in minutes on the confusion before settling around a 2.5% gain. And somewhere in Tehran, behind closed doors, the regime is staring at a situation it does not know how to answer. So far in the war, Washington had been reluctant to put U.S. Navy warships within range of Iranian shore-based anti-ship missiles or the swarms of small attack craft that Tehran can field in numbers in and around the Strait of Hormuz. That reluctance is now gone. And the significance of that shift cannot be overstated. When the most powerful navy in the world decides it is done waiting at the edges and move us into the contested waterway itself, the entire strategic dynamic of the conflict changes. This is no longer a war being fought from a distance. The United States has just stepped directly into Iran's self-declared zone of control, and it has done so with a force package E that Iran's weakened military is structurally incapable of confronting. Let's be precise about what Project Freedom actually is. Montague used the framing matters enormously here. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper described it as a defensive mission, stating that U.S. support is essential to regional security and the global economy, while simultaneously clarifying that the naval blockade of Iranian port remains fully in place. That is a critical distinction. The United States is not lifting its economic stranglehold on Iran. It is adding a new dimension to it. It is attempting to restore commercial shipping for the rest of the world while continuing to suffocate Iran. His own trade. The message to Tehran is brutally clear. The global economy reopens on American terms, not Iranian ones, and Iran does not get to collect a single dollar of toll revenue while that process unfolds. Iran's response on the ground today revealed a regime that is simultaneously furious, frightened, and deeply uncertain about how far it can push back. Iranian IRGC-affiliated media claimed that a U.S. Navy frigate near the port of Jask was struck by 2 missiles. CENTCOM flatly denied that any U.S. Navy ship had been hit, and Iran, his own Navy, walked the claim back, saying instead that it had fired warning shots and issued warnings to American destroyers. Think about that for a moment. Iran's first instinct was to claim a decisive military strike against the U.S. Navy. Its second instinct, when challenged, was to quietly revise that claim downward to warning shots. That is not the behavior of a confident military power. That is the behavior of a regime trying to project strength it no longer possesses. Iran's Army Commander-in-Chief, Major General Amir Hatami, warned that any attempt by U.S. aircraft carriers to approach the Strait of Hormuz would be met with force, stating that cruise missiles and combat drones had already taken to the skies. These are not empty words from Iran's perspective. The IRGC still has asymmetric abilities. It still has fast boats, drones, mines, and shore-based missile batteries, but capabilities and political will to use them are two entirely different things. Iran knows what happened the last time it chose escalation. Operation Epic Fury reduced its conventional military to rubble in a matter of weeks. The regime is now calculating, almost certainly on a minute-by-minute basis, whether RESPO ending to Project Freedom with genuine military force would trigger a resumption of American airstrikes against what little remains of TS infrastructure. That calculation keeps coming out the same way. The cost of escalation is regime ending. The cost of humiliation is survivable, for now. The United Arab Emirates, meanwhile, condemned what it called an Iranian terrorist attack on a tanker belonging to the state-owned Abu Dhabi National Oil Company ADNOC that was attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Iran struck an Emirati Sanate oil tanker on the same day the U.S. was launching a humanitarian escort mission. If Tehran was attempting to demonstrate that its ill controls the waterway, the message landed very differently than intended. What the international community saw was not Iranian res olvo. It was Iranian desperation. An attack on a neutral Gulf state's oil tanker on a day when the world was watching to see whether commercial shipping could finally resume is not the action of a regime that believes it is winning. It is the action of a regime lashing out because its options are narrowing by the hour. Now here is where the situation becomes genuinely layered in a way that most rage is missing entirely. Project Freedom is happening simultaneously with something the U.S. has been building quietly for weeks, the maritime freedom construct. The U.S. State Department announced the Maritime Freedom Construct as a framework to enhance information sharing and diplomatic coordination among partner nations, designed to work in conjunction with Project Freedom's military operations. is not just an American operation anymore. This is Washington assembling a coalition-level architecture around the Strait of Hormuz, one that ties diplomatic, economic, and military pressure into a single integrated strategy. 38 countries have already signed a statement expressing readiness to contribute to efforts ensuring safe passage and condemning attacks on commercial shipping. Iran is not facing the United States alone. It is facing a broad international consensus that its control over the strait is illegitimate, unsustainable, and economically catastrophic for too many nations to tolerate. The shipping industry, for its part, is watching carefully but remains skeptical. Shipping executives are not yet convinced that the new U.S. plan sufficiently reduces the risks of transiting the waterway, and Iranian forces still maintain the ability to attack vessels the rough drones, fast boats, and mines, even if intelligence on mine positions is being shared. That skepticism is rational. 2 American F-lagged vessels made it through today. That is, 2 vessels where there used to be 125 to 140 per day. The gap between a demonstration of capability and a full restoration of commercial shipping is enormous, but what today proved is that the gap is closable. Iran could no T-stop American ships from transiting when backed by guided missile destroyers and over 100 aircraft. That proof of concept matters far, more than the tonnage of the two ships that made it through. What is really happening here, beneath the military maneuvering and the co-impeding press releases, is a battle of timelines. The United States is asking a very simple question: how long can Iran bleed before it either comes to the table on Washington's terms or collapses under its own weight? Tehran is losing an estimated $500 million per day DUE to the blockade, according to a White House official, while oil and condensate loadings at Iranian ports have collapsed from 2.1 million line barrels per day before the blockade to just 567,000 barrels per day after it was imposed. That is a revenue catastrophe unfolding in real time. And with Project Freedom now in motion, adding a military dimension to the economic one, the timeline for Iran is compresses. Nung. The question is no longer whether Iran can survive this. The question is how much longer it can pretend it can. To understand the Tiru depth of Iran's crisis, you have to look beyond the naval standoff and into the economy that is now consuming itself from the inside. Out. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a military battlefield, it is the financial lifeline of the Iranian state. And that leaf Elaine has been cut with a precision that no missile could replicate. What the numbers reveal, when you actually sit down and go through them source by source, is a picture of an economy that was already standing at the edge of a cliff before Operation Epic Fury began, and D is now being pushed off it inch by inch every single day the blockade holds. Before the conflict, Iran was already operating under immense economic strain. Inflation had exceeded 50% in 2025, and the Iranian rial had lost 60% of its value in the months following the 12-day war against the US the previous July. That was the baseline. That was the starting point from which Iran entered this war. No, a position of strength. Not a nation with deep reserves and political stability, a nation already dealing with a currency in freefall, a population that had already taken to the streets, and an oil sector that was its only meaningful source of hard currency. The International Monetary Fund projected Iran's economy to shrink by 6.1% in 2026, with inflation reaching 68.9% by the end of the year. Those projections were made before the full weight of the American blockade was factored in. The real numbers, when they eventually surface, will almost certainly be worse. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the subsequent U.S. blockade have cut off more than 90% of Iran's international trade, which accounts for 70% of the country's entire export revenues. Read that again slowly. 90% of Iran's international trade gone, not reduced, not disrupted, functionally eliminated. Iran had been pumping over 3 million barrels of crude oil per day before the war, but since the American blockade began on April 13th, ships have filled with oil and been unable to lower Port. The oil is being produced, but it has nowhere to go. Storage is filling. Tankers are sitting idle near Karg Island, Iran's Rimari export terminal. And the clock on how long this can continue before the entire production system seizes is ticking louder every day. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent posted publicly that Iran's oil industry is starting to shut down production under the pressure of the blockade, warning that gasoline shortages inside Iran could follow. Iran's own state television, in a telling moment of unintentional transparency, broadcast a segment where journalists openly discussed the possibility of an oil storage crisis, with one noting that if empty tankers are blocked from returning, the country simply will not be able to export at all. That is Iranian state media, the outlet controlled by hardliners inside the regime. When the propaganda apparatus starts airing the unvarnished economic reality, it is a signal that the situation has moved beyond the regime's ability to manage the narrative. Bessent went further in a Fox News interview on May 4th, declaring that America is currently suffocating Iran through intense financial and economic constraints, stating bluntly that Iran is not able to pay its soldiers, and that this is a real economic blockade in every meaningful sense. The human dimension of this crisis is where things become truly staggering in scale. Senior Iranian economic officials reportedly warned President Masoud Pezeshkian that it may take more than a decade to rebuild the war-torn economy, according to Iranian journalists. Okel Media citing sources familiar with internal deliberations. A decade. And that is the optimistic internal assessment, the one being shared behind closed doors rather than on state television. Iran's central bank governor has reportedly urged Pezeshkian to take urgent steps to stabilize the economy, including restoring full internet access and pursuing a peace deal with the United States as a matter of immediate necessity. When the central bank governor is telling the president to make a deal, the economic emergency has reached the highest levels of the institutional state. Infrastructure damage from the war has been estimated at between $200 billion and $270 billion, according to retired U.S. Army Colonel Seth Crumrich, vice president at the security firm Global Guardian. That figure alone would be EVA is stating for a healthy, sanctions-free economy with full access to international capital markets. For Iran, a nation cut off from the global financial system, with no meaningful foreign investment, no access to dollar-denominated credit, and now no oil export revenue, T is an almost incomprehensible burden. Crumrich told CNBC directly that with no economy, failing basic social services, no alternate political or governmental option, and no global allies willing to intervene, a serious humanitarian disaster is actively brewing inside Iran. Medicine prices have become a particularly acute flashpoint. Reports received by Iran International indicate that some drug prices inside Iran have surged by as much as 380% in recent weeks, as the country grapples with soaring inflation, a collapsing currency, and worsening wartime supply disruptions. This is not an abstraction. This is families unable to afford medication for chronic conditions. Is hospitals running low on basic supplies. This is a population that already had legitimate grievances against its government, now Fei. A daily material reality that is becoming impossible to endure. And the regime knows this, because it has been here before. The protests that swept Iran in late 2025 and early 2026, the ones that the regime crushed with reported mass killings, were triggered by economic despair that was a fraction of what the population is experiencing right now. Fortune reported that Iran has begun curbing oil production already in an attempt to manage storage constraints and preserve the ability to ramp production back up if conditions ease. But heating production carries its own risks that the regime may be underestimating. Oil reservoirs depend on stable pressure, and poorly managed production shutdowns can cause lasting damage to wells, an outcome the White House is openly betting on. Once those wells are damaged, the revenue loss does not end when the blockade ends. It extends for years, possibly permanently for the oldest fields. Iran is not just losing today's oil revenue. It may be permanently impairing tomorrow's production capacity. The economic wound the United States is inflicting is designed not just to hurt now, but to scar deeply enough that Iran cannot simply rebound once a deal is eventually signed. Iran International reported that Iran's economy is likely to buckle faster than the United States or the global economy under the combi. Net pressure of war, sanctions, the U.S. blockade, and Tehran's own disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, according to experts who present at a Washington town hall. That last part deserves to be highlighted. Iran's own closure of the strait is contributing to its own economic destruction. The weapon it reached for to hurt America is cutting its own hands. So where does all of this lead? Because that is the question that actually matters right now. Not just what is happening in the strait today, but what happens next. What does Iran do when its economy is hemorrhaging $500 million per day? Its oil storage is weeks away from sea ice in capacity. Its population is paying 380% more for medicine. And the United States Navy has just demonstrated it can move ships through the Strait of Hormuz regardless of Iranian warnings. The answer to that question is already beginning to take shape, and it is more revealing than anything Iran's commanders have said publicly. Iran blinked first. That is the honest assessment of what has happened diplomatically over the past week. A senior Iranian official confirmed that Tehran submitted a 14-point proposal that would open shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and end the U.S. blockade of Iran, while deliberately leaving talks on Iran's nuclear program for a later stage. Read T-Hat carefully. Iran, the country that has defined its entire regional identity around its nuclear program for 2 decades, is now trying to separate the nuclear question from the immediate crisis, because it needs relief from the blockade badly enough to offer concession it would never have considered before February 28th. The proposal also included a guarantee that Israel and the United States would attack Iran again, the withdrawal of U.S. forces from surrounding areas, the release of frozen Iranian assets, compensation payments, and a lifting of all sanctions. It is an expansive ask, but the very fact that Iran is making formal written proposals at all tells you everything about the pressure it is operating under. Trump's response was characteristically blunt. He told reporters he had been briefed on the concept of a deal, but was waiting for the exact wording, while simultaneously warning that restarting strikes remained alive. Option if Iran, in his words, misbehaves. Washington has repeatedly stated it will not end the conflict without a deal that prevents Iran. The nuclear question is not being shelved from the American side, regardless of how Iran tries to sequence the negotiations. And that fundamental gap between what Iran is offering and what the U.S. is demanding is why, despite the proposals and the back-channel communicates. On being facilitated by Pakistan, a deal has not materialized. Pakistan's Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and Army Chief have all been actively encouraging direct talks between Washington and Tehran, and Islamabad has been passing messages between the two sides since hosting face-to-face talks last month. The diplomatic architecture is being maintained. The channels are open. But channels and conclusio NS are very different things. And right now, the gap between the two sides remains wide enough that Project Freedom launched today without any negotiated resolution in sight. Trump is clearly calculating that the pressure of the blockade combined with the military assertion of Project Freedom will compress Iran's timeline to the point where Tehran has no choice but to accept terms closer to Washington's position than its own. There is one variable in this equation that deserves far more attention than it is currently receiving: China. Iran has approximately 120 million barrels of oil loaded on tankers east of the U.S. blockade zone that can potentially be delivered to CUC. Tomers including China, which represents roughly 2 months of revenue for Tehran. China's teapot refineries, the independent processor S that have historically absorbed sanctioned Iranian crude at steep discounts, are a potential lifeline for the regime. But the U.S. Treasury Department moved aggressively this week, sanctioning dozens of individuals accused of overseeing Iran's shadow banking network, Besant, specifically naming teapot refineries among the targets. Washington is not leaving that back door open. It is closing every XI. Here's what I think we are really watching unfold, and this is the part that rarely gets said plainly enough. The United States has co-instructed a trap with no clean exit for the Iranian regime. If Tehran capitulates on the nuclear question and signs a deal, the regime survives but is permanently diminished, stripped of the deterrent it spent billions building and defined its entire strategic doctrine around. If Tehran refuses and holds out, the economy continues to collapse. Oil production risks permanent damage. The population faces an increasingly unbearable material reality, and the conditions for a repeat of the January 2026 protests, this time potentially on an even larger scale, grow more likely by the week. Analysts from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies have pointed out that if oil workers begin losing their jobs as production slows, the unrest could spread to Iran's most strategically vital provinces and industries, echoing dynamics from the 1979 revolution. The regime remembers 1979. It knows what an oil worker strike looks like when it gains momentum. And today, May 4th, 2026, Project Freedom just made the trap one wall tighter. Because now the United States has demonstrated that it see and physically move commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz over Iranian objections. Every day that more vessels transit under American protection is a day that Iran's claim to control the waterway erodes further in the eyes of the international community. Iran's deputy parliament speaker declared publicly that Tehran will not back down from its position on the Strait of Hormuz and that it will not return to its pre-war conditions. But declarations and capabilities are diverging rapidly. The regime can say whatever it wants. What it cannot do is stop American guided missile destroyers backed by 100 aircraft and 15,000 personnel from operating in the strait it misses to own. What Iran feared most was never the airstrikes. Airstrikes destroy hardware and they kill people, but regimes have survived AI airstrikes before. What Iran feared most was precisely this: an American strategy patient enough, sophisticated enough, and economically devastating enough to make the regime's continued resistance more costly than surrender. That strategy is now fully operational. The blockade is bleeding Iran's treasury. Project Freedom is breaking Iran's grip on the waterway. The diplomatic clock is running, and somewhat here, between the next proposal from Tehran and the next transit of a commercial vessel under American protection, the endgame of this conflict is being written. If you want to stay ahead of every development